Okay, we're going to continue with our verse-by-verse study. It's August 14th, 2019, and it's Wednesday. And we're picking up where we left off last time, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3. And what we read last time, we read how the Lord was in the temple from Matthew chapter 21 up until Matthew chapter, the end of verse 20, or actually Matthew chapter 23. And then he had departed the temple in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. It said, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came unto him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So we're seeing in verse 3 that they ask him these three questions. And so we're going to see he's going to answer, and we'll go up to verse 30, so we probably won't get every single answer in this one lesson tonight, but we'll try to go through a good 25, 27 verses tonight. And so we're going to go through and see what we can go through with the first couple of verses. And even this is just meant to be a basic information so you can go further than where we're at. But we're trying to actually dispel what we're surrounded by, because Matthew chapter 24 is a huge chapter that everybody, all the different ministries and all the different so-called churches and everything, they take Matthew chapter 24 and they take that and they line it up with the newspaper that shows up, or with the internet, or with everything else. And there's where you get your prophecy experts. That's where you get your Armageddon prophecy, end times experts, quote unquote. And they'll take Matthew chapter 24 to say, well, that's why the earthquake happened in Mexico, and that's why there's diseases and famines and wars and earthquakes, because Matthew chapter 24 said it was going to happen, and that's why it happened last Tuesday, and this is why this is going to be the way it is. And they're completely off, because we've gone so far in the book of Matthew, we haven't found one verse or one word that applies to the church, the body of Christ, and we're not going to find it now in Matthew chapter 24. Everything that the Lord is saying is written to Israel as they are to go through the tribulation, which is what Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 was teaching them how to prepare for it, and what he was going to be looking for. He was going to be looking for the pure in heart. He was going to be looking for the peacemakers. He was going to be looking for those who were persecuted. He was going to be looking for all of this, which had to do, or has to do, with the tribulation, which is Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, and how they're going to have to depend on the Lord, not to worry about what to wear, what to eat, what to drink, all these other things that we saw from Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And so when they ask in verse 3, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? He's going to start explaining to them certain events and certain sequences that we'll see how they line up with the Bible, how they line up with prophecy, how prophecy should line up with prophecy, according to the Bible rightly divided, not according to the newspaper last week, or not according to the newspaper next week, not according to the dispensation of grace and preaching Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. Matthew chapter 24 is not going to line up with the Apostle Paul, because we haven't even read about the Apostle Paul yet in the book of Matthew. So those are two intentionally separate things. So we're going to be reading about Israel and the other themes that go with it, the law, prophecy, the ages to come with where we are now in time past, and we'll see through the prophecy program how they connect, because the Lord is going to be warning them about what's to come. And so there is no mention of the parenthetical period that we're in now, the dispensation of grace. There's no mentioning of the Apostle Paul. There's no mentioning of the revelation of the mystery. The revealing of the mystery isn't revealed in Matthew chapter 24. So that's why once we rightly divide the word of truth and we understand that there is no, in Matthew chapter 24 at this time, there is no revelation of the mystery, there is no Apostle Paul, there is no dispensation of grace. It's hid, but it's not revealed. the Apostle Paul is, for all intents and purposes, Saul of Tarsus still at this time. The dispensation of grace is still not known. Nothing is known. The revelation of the mystery is very much hidden. And so we'll see, as we do into Matthew chapter 24, how the Lord explains what's been explained since the foundation of the world, essentially, when we look at the major prophets, the minor prophets, everything else. Even Genesis chapter 3 talks about how Satan will be bruised. And you see at least that much in Genesis. And that's the whole point of where we're going, essentially, quote unquote, in Matthew chapter 24, and how this will occur in the book of Revelation. And so you don't find that in the newspaper today. Ministries will try to take that and take, say something in Genesis 3, match it up with Matthew 24, throw it into Revelation 6, and then say, well, there it is on the front page of the paper. This proves the Bible's true. And that's completely incorrect, and will just have you running down the wrong trail of total insanity. So what we'll do is we'll open up in prayer, and we'll go verse by verse from verse 3 through Matthew chapter 24. So, Lord, we're thankful for this day of grace and the dispensation of grace where we can learn what you've said to your disciples in the prophecy program, so we can better understand who you are and to know you better, so that we can understand your plans and purposes, not only in prophecy, but how we can better rightly divide your word in the dispensation of grace. So we're thankful for this as we continue to study. Amen. So in verse 3, we see those three questions that the disciples are asking the Lord based on the fact that he's walked out of that temple. And so his kingdom's essentially by unbelieving Israel has been rejected now. He himself has essentially been rejected now by unbelieving Israel. And so from this point on, it's going to be all about headed to the cross. And he's already told this to his disciples as well. But in the meantime, they ask these three questions. And so he says, they ask those three questions. And so we see in verse 4, it says, and Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. So he starts out talking about the answers to the questions they're asking in verse 4. And they're saying in verse 3, and the answers that come in verse 4 and 5, he answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. So what this does is this is going to line up with what we'll see in the book of Revelation. If we look at, first I'll explain it and then we'll go to it. In the book of Revelation, you have three tellings of what's occurring in the book of Revelation. You have three explanations, three eyewitness accounts, three viewpoints of the day of the Lord, of Daniel's 70th week. You have in Revelation chapter 6, verse 1 through Revelation 7, verse 17, you have one account of everything that's happening, one perspective, one eyewitness account, one viewpoint of everything that's happening. And right at the end, you see how the Lord gets the kingdom and gets everything and wraps everything up with a bow by Revelation 7:17. And then it moves on and it goes through a second telling of everything. Everything goes through, and we'll look at this. And then you go through everything all over again from a second viewpoint, a second telling, a second explanation, a second eyewitness account. And by the time you get to Revelation 11:15, you've got the Lord wrapping everything up with a bow. He gets the kingdom, and it's like it happened all over again, because it's a second viewpoint from a second perspective of him getting the kingdom. And then as we go through a third time, you see that everything happens for a third viewpoint, from a third perspective, third eyewitness account, and that's where it wraps up towards the end in Revelation 22. So you see that all take place, and then the third part talks about wonders. You've got the seven wonders. The second account talks about how there's different judgments. You have the destruction of the vegetation, destruction of the sea, destruction of the fresh water, the locusts, and everything else. That's the second telling. The first telling talks about the seven seals. So if we look at Revelation chapter 6, we'll go in verse 1. And we'll match it up bit for bit. The point of going through that just a moment ago is that you can take Matthew 24 and fit them into the first telling, the second telling, and the third telling. They fit into each perspective, each eyewitness account of the book of Revelation. And so this is how, when the Lord is explaining this to the little flock, to Israel, is how it all fits. It doesn't fit into your daily newspaper. It fits into the Bible. It fits into the book of Revelation. It fits where it should in the word rightly divided. So Revelation chapter 6 and verse 4, I believe. Actually, let me see. Let's see. Or actually, verse 1, I'm sorry. Revelation chapter 6, verse 1 says, "And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, Come and see. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, Come and see." And so you're seeing, just in these first couple of verses, you're seeing the first seal open and the second seal open. But the first seal is talking about, in verse 2, Revelation 6:2 says, "Behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer." So you're seeing that this is all about, in this case, you're seeing this being about the Antichrist. He has a crown, so he's going to look like God, he's going to talk like God, he's going to go out and conquer, though, however, in a military fashion. And so you see him, he looks like God, he's going to talk like God, he's going to wear a crown, pretend to be God. And then, of course, as you go back to where we just were, Matthew chapter 24, and you see the Lord's response about deception. And you see how, as you go back and forth between Revelation 6 and Matthew chapter 24, it's going to match up. And so you see in Matthew 24, verse 4. Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying that I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Well, we just saw in Revelation chapter 6, the Antichrist will wear a crown, and will be put on, let's see, where's that? And it says, and behold, a white horse. So he's going to be on a white horse. He's going to be wearing a crown. So he's going to look, talk, and act like God. Of course, he's not God. He's a false king. He's a liar. And he's going to pretend to be God. He's going to deceive many, even the elect, if it were possible. And he's going to pretend to be God and trick everybody. And he's going to declare himself to be God and deceive everybody. So you see that in verse 4 and 5, and that's what the Lord's warning the little flock about. And he's telling them all about this. You see this as the first seal. And so he says, and as he continues on in Matthew chapter 24, verse 6, he says, And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So then you see about wars and rumors of wars. Of course, this goes back to not plugging this into the newspaper, because you're always going to read about wars in some place or some country or somewhere. But when we see about wars and rumors of wars, the Antichrist is going to start up some wars. And he's going to do all these things in the future. And so the little flock will hear about wars and rumors of wars. And he says in verse 6, See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So he's telling them, just because you hear about the Antichrist rising to power and wars and rumors of wars, the end's not yet. So he's letting them know this. And of course, as you go to Revelation chapter 6, and you go and look at verse 3, and about the second seal, and we see it says, And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, Come and see. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. Well, there's wars and rumors of wars right there. And so you're seeing this take place through the personification or the putting in of the red horse. And that's wars and rumors of wars. And that's going to be, the power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. Well, you take away peace from the earth, you have war. And that they should kill one another. And that's throughout the idea of war. And that there was given unto him a great sword. And that's going to be through that. So, you see that in verse 6 and 7. It says, in verse 7, going back to Matthew chapter 24, it says, For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. We know, as we've studied before, there's going to be famines and pestilences as a result of the wars that occur. That's just going to be something that happens. There's going to be famines and pestilences as a result. And there's going to be earthquakes in diverse places as a result of all this. And this is in verse 8 that all these are the beginning of sorrows. So all of this is just yet the beginning. This is only the beginning of what's being explained. You have a false king rising to power. These things are just starting to take place. This is yet occurring. This is essentially seal number 1 and 2 and 3. And we've read 1 and 2, but as you keep going in Revelation chapter 6, going back to this, what you see is he mentions in Revelation 6, verse 5, it says, And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse. And he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. When he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. So you're seeing famine as a result of one horse, and what follows famine is going to be death, which is exactly what the Lord's talking about in Matthew chapter 24. So everything keeps lining up, Revelation 6 with Matthew 24. And then one thing we won't do tonight, but as you keep plugging it into the second eyewitness account, in Revelation 8 through 11, you'll see that Matthew 24 can line up with certain events in that eyewitness account. And then as you go through essentially Revelation chapter 12 through the end, you can plug in certain events of Matthew chapter 24 into the third eyewitness account. So you're seeing Matthew 24 lining up where it should with the Bible rightly divided in the book of Revelation. And this is what the Lord is telling the little flock about the events and the times to come. And so, as he mentions this on, as he continues on, what he's saying, as we left off in verse 9, says, Then, talking to Israel, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and they shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And so you're seeing this take place, this is going on in verse 9, which is what the little flock should expect during the tribulation. This is what the Lord mentioned earlier. If you look at Matthew chapter 10, verse 17, the Lord mentioned this to them earlier. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 17, he warned them about this in earlier verses that we had studied. And we see there, he says, But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. And ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, take no thought how or what ye shall speak, for it shall be given you in that same hour what ye shall speak. For it is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. And the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child. And the children shall rise up against their parents, and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that endureth to the end shall be saved. So even in Matthew chapter 10, as we studied before, he was talking about this time. He's going deeper now into this since the disciples are asking more about it. So as we go back into where we were, Matthew chapter 24, he goes and says from verse 9, he says, Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and talking to the little flock, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Talking about, for the sake of the name of Christ, Jesus Christ. And then shall many be offended, as we just saw from Matthew chapter 10. You can also see more in Matthew chapter 11, and this also takes place from the parables we saw in Matthew chapter 13. And it says, And many shall be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And verse 11 says, And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And so you see that many false prophets shall rise. If you remember back in Matthew chapter 7, if we go there, Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, he warned them about this as well, talking about many false prophets are going to arise during this time. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 15, what he had mentioned even back then, during Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, and Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 15, he warned them about how many false prophets are going to arise. He says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. So he warns them about the false prophets that will show up during the tribulation, that will show up and pretend to be part of the little flock in order to get them to join up with the Antichrist during this time. So verse 11, going back to Matthew chapter 24, says, And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. Then verse 12, And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. And we can see examples of this, Revelation 3:15, for example. And we see, as we continue on, verse 13, it says, But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Talking about he that shall endure to the end of the tribulation, which is the context of Matthew chapter 24. He that's part of Israel, he of the little flock, or he that joins up with the little flock, that endures to the end of the tribulation. We're seeing that from verse 13. The same shall be saved. You're saved physically from the troubles of the tribulation, the great tribulation, which none of the body of Christ goes through. But a lot of ministries or churches or denominations or whatever you want to call them will take Matthew chapter 24 verse 13 and make that their salvation verse. And they'll say something to the effect of they may put it on their bulletin, they may put it on their gospel tracts, they may put it on their sermons, and say, remember Matthew chapter 24 verse 13, he that endures unto the end, the same will be saved. So you got to keep up those good works. You got to keep up your walk, or whatever it is. Whatever it is they're trying to push, whatever is their agenda, you got to keep it up. You got to keep going. And well, that's a nice, I didn't say nice, but a worthy thing to say, keep up your behavior, so on and so forth. If you're preaching that for salvation, then that's nothing but a hell-bound message. If you're trying to preach behavior for heaven, then all you're preaching is nothing but hell. So it's great to preach, let's keep up the behavior, so on and so forth. But after you're saved, and even then, you don't want to go to Matthew chapter 24 for that. You want to read all about what does Paul, the apostle, say about behavior and everything else, not just behavior, not that alone, but everything. So to go to Matthew chapter 24 concerning behavior is way off. But to go to the apostle Paul concerning everything we need for doctrine is where we want to go, and then study the whole Bible in its entirety, rightly divided. So So we see that from Matthew chapter 24 as we continue on in verse 12, I believe. 14. And it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." So, of course, he's saying, and the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. So, of course, he's talking about the gospel of the kingdom, in which today, 1 Corinthians 15 is the gospel we preach today. So as we go into Matthew chapter 24, someone goes there to talk about how that's our future. It's not our future. The gospel that they preach is not even the gospel that we're preaching today. The gospel that they're talking about is the gospel of the kingdom, which Israel is to preach, which the little flock is to preach during this time. And we see that from verse 14. "And this gospel of the kingdom," which we can find out all about in Mark chapter 1, verse 14, or Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, "shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." And then, of course, verse 15, it gets more focused. It gets more focused on the Antichrist. It gets more focused on what, concerning him and what's going on with this. He says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." Of course, this goes back to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, Daniel chapter 11, verse 21. He says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation," talking about the Antichrist, "spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." He says, "Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." And so you see that from verse 16. He's saying, let them flee into the mountains. And so based on when he's going to not only rise to power, but enforce his whole entire mark of the beast, his economy based on the mark of the beast, they're to flee into the mountains. And so we see that take place in there. And so they'll run and they'll flee as needed. The little flock will. And that's in verse 16. And then it says, "Let him," in verse 17, "let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. And neither let him which is in the field return to take back his clothes." So that sounds more like what we're understanding from if we look at Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. This goes back to what the Lord was teaching, and we already saw a little bit from Matthew chapter 7. Now in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, as we're seeing, the Lord talked about, "Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything, neither let him which is in the field return to take his clothes." Sounds like they're not to be worried about anything. Don't be worried about picking up your clothes. Don't be worried about doing this. Just run and flee into the mountains. Based on what we see in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25. It says, "Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body, what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body more than raiment?" And so he goes on explaining how he's going to be their provider during this time. This is what we see in Matthew chapter 6. And this is what he's explaining to the little flock of Israel concerning this time. And so this is what he was preparing for them in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And what we're seeing him explain further in Matthew chapter 24. And so we see that he's saying in 18 and 19 exactly that. And then he says, "But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day." And then he says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be." So he's mentioning then shall be great tribulation. So then it rises up, it intensifies even more. If you look at Mark 13:19, I believe it's in Mark 13:19 where you see something similar mentioned as well. In Mark 13:19, he mentions this from Mark's perspective. And so we're seeing all this from Matthew, but Mark mentions, of course, the same things that are going on. And he says, "For in those days shall be affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation, which God created unto this time, neither shall be." So you're seeing Mark's account of this, as well as what we're seeing from Matthew's. And Mark mentions this here in verse 21. And he says, "And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." And of course, when he mentioned those days shall be shortened, we know from Acts chapter 1 and Acts chapter 2 and so on, up until the revelation of the mystery, that was tribulation events taking place. Those were events, the tribulation essentially already got started in Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 2, and so on, up until the Lord gave to Paul the revelation of the mystery. So those days were already shortened out of a 7-year time period. Some of it already got started. The events were shortened for all intents and purposes to the events of Acts chapter 1 up until God gave to Paul the revelation of the mystery. And so the days were shortened. And we see this in verse 22. "Except those days be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." And then he goes, as he continues on in verse 23, he says, then, as he's moving on in his timeline of explanation, says, "Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not." And so he's mentioning that there's going to be people saying, well, Christ is over here and Christ is over there. And so what he's essentially saying is that he's going to have his false prophets and his false priests and his false believers and his false works and everything that's false going out to promote that, oh, Christ is over here and Christ is over there and so on and so forth, just spreading lies like crazy to bring them out from the mountains, out from where they fled to. And so he's saying that verse 23, "Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christ and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." And so you're seeing them mention that there in verse 24, "There shall arise false Christ and false prophets." We saw that in Matthew chapter 7. And this also gets mentioned in the book of 1 John. 1 John, that's why it's given tests. They give several tests. I believe it's 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. If we look there real quick. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18. What we'll see in there, John gives several tests so that they can know. But he mentions to the little flock something specific here. And he says in verse 2, 18, he says, "Little children, it is the last time. And as ye have heard the Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us, but they went out, that they might be made manifest that they were not all of us." So you see that there. And if you look at chapter 4, verse 3 of 1 John, this is how they know. This is one of the ways, the many ways they know, that they were never part of the little flock. And this is 1 John chapter 4, verse 3. It says, "And every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh, and is not of God, and this is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now is already in the world." And so there's going to be those that are saying, well, that Jesus Christ, he's not God, that guy, which is going to be the Antichrist, he's God. And they'll be in the camp of the little flock trying to manipulate them, lie to them, and get them to take the mark of the beast, walk away from Jesus Christ and the little flock, and they'll be trying to just cause havoc within the little flock camps. So as we come back to where we are in Matthew chapter 24, we're seeing just a timeline of the Lord just blatantly, in detail, explain everything that's going to happen verbatim to the little flock. And every time it's great to see that every time the Pharisees and Sadducees try to trick him, he blatantly, in detail, is able to verbally massacre the Pharisees and Sadducees. When it comes to answering the questions of the disciples, he's able to, in great detail, answer their question. When they say, when's the sign, when is the sign of your coming? When is the end of the world? He doesn't just give, a 5-word answer. He starts explaining in great detail and in the specific timeline what's going to happen. And it just so happens that it lines up with what the Apostle John writes based on visions that he has. And it lines up perfectly in order. So this is another way you know that this book is perfectly in order. So we see that from Matthew chapter 24. We see this from Revelation chapter 6. We see it from Revelation chapter 8. We see it from Revelation chapter 12. And we see it also in the minor and the major prophets, that the events that they write about, the things that they see, also correlate with everything that is in God's word rightly divided. So, as we continue on, and we're in verse, we're in verse 24.
We just finished it.
Okay, 24, now we're in 25. He says, behold, I have told you before. It says, wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So what he's saying to them in verse 26 and 27, he's essentially telling them to stay in their hiding places, stay in the mountains. Because in verse 26, it says, if anyone says to you that he's in the desert, go not forth. Or if he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. So if someone during the tribulation comes up to the little flock and says, oh, he's in the secret chambers over there, go meet Christ. We found him. Or, oh, he's over there in the desert. Why don't you go out there and meet him? They're just, what the Lord is telling us, they're pretty much trying to trap you and kill you. If they say that because what he says in verse 27 is, for as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. When the lightning strikes from the east to the west, everybody sees it. And what he's saying is, I'm not going to come the way I came the first time. I came, essentially quietly and unknown. The first coming, he came quietly, came in a manger. He was kind of unknown, except to those around him. Of course, the heavenly angels saw everything, and God, of course, knew everything. But the second time, he says, when I come, I'm coming. When I come, it's going to be like the lightning. Everyone's going to see it. It's not going to be one of these secret chamber things. Oh, he's over there. And, or he's in the desert. Why don't you run out in the desert and go find him? He says, when I come, it's going to be like lightning. Everyone's going to see it. So don't believe it. When these false prophets, when these false people, when these false priests, when these false believers say that I'm over there in the desert, or I'm over there in the secret chambers, don't go running off over there. Stay hid in the mountains. Stay hid in the mountains. Stay hid where you are in your hiding places. Because when I come, it's going to be like the lightning. And everyone's going to know. This is how he's explaining this to the little flock. So, we see that in verse 27 and in 28, he says, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. And so, as he's talking about that there, he's essentially talking about the dead bodies that are going to be from the fight at Megiddo that he's going to have. He's saying, wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. And so he's talking about that, the fight they're going to have, and wherever the carcasses are going to be, there will the eagles be gathered together. They're going to be, eating the flesh. You can read more about how the Lord will come back and violently dispose of his enemies, all through Isaiah chapter 63. You can see it also in Revelation chapter 19, how it's going to be a great battle. The Lord's going to win. He'll come in judgment and war, Revelation chapter 19:11. He'll destroy his enemies, and the birds will eat the flesh of his enemies. And so that's what he's talking about in verse 29. I'm sorry, verse 28. And in verse 29 and verse 30, and we'll wrap up here at verse 30, it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So in verse 29, we're seeing immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven. And the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. You're seeing a sequence of events where these things are going to start happening. And if you look all the way back, I believe it's in Isaiah 13:10, he mentions this even during Isaiah's day too, that these things are going to happen. Isaiah 13, verse 10, saying pretty much when you read the major prophets, when you read the minor prophets, they line up with some of the events in Matthew chapter 24, which line up with the book of Revelation, because the whole book matches itself as far as prophecy. Prophecy and then mystery is its own thing, and when you rightly divide it, everything works, because truth, rightly divided from truth, it's all truth. And so Revelation 13, verse 10, Isaiah 13, verse 10, it says, for the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And he says, and I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. And I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. And I will make man more precious than fine gold. And he'll continue on with what he's talking with concerning Isaiah. But you're seeing these events mentioned in Isaiah. And then it'll move on to the restoration of Israel as it keeps going forward. But you're seeing the prophetic plan of what's going on with God and all these different books. But he's saying this in verse 29. And going back to Matthew 24:29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So you're seeing that iniquity is shaken, and you're seeing that it says the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then we see there, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And you see that that's Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, I believe. Yeah, Revelation chapter 1, verse 7 is a good cross-reference to this verse. And it says this, and then shall appear a sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Sign of the Son of Man in heaven just means that's the Lord Jesus Christ coming back in war and judgment. He's not coming back in a peaceful, quiet, meek, and mild-mannered way. He's coming back. That's him coming back. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So there's a lot of information given here. So we just wanted to start off with this piece of information here, which is, we threw a lot out in this one time. But from it, we're hoping that you watching on YouTube can take this and grow from it. If there's something that is you can build on, take it, build on it, grow from it here, because what you're reading in your daily newspaper is just not going to cut it. It's not going to work. It's not going to cut it. If you're hearing it from an assembly or church or building that's reading tomorrow's paper and lining it up with the prophecy experts on the TV shows, then that's also not going to work. But we'll stop here, and we'll continue next time in Matthew chapter 24 and keep going forth with what the Lord is speaking to Israel about concerning the tribulation and the day of the Lord.